Hey guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. Now, this is my final factor in my series that assesses the cause of Tudor rebellions. So, if you haven't seen the first two on religion and economics, go and do so. There'll be one more that follows with some overarching conclusions, really, really helpful for those final summative thoughts. But hopefully, this will be really useful if you're studying the 1C AQA option on the Tudors. And as I say in most of these videos, I think that this question is super, super good if you get it and you know exactly what you're writing about because you've already got all this evidence categorized. Now, in terms of political causes are all through the Tudor dynasty. Every single rebellion, or almost every single rebellion, I think you can argue has some link to political causes. Now, the reason for that is that most rebellions do have some representation from the nobility, and marginalization because of religion, because of faction, because of falling out of favor are really one of the only things that pushes those people who have relatively nice, comfortable lives to risk what being involved in a rebellion really risks: life, loss of fortune, your children being disinherited, etc. So therefore, while political causes normally aren't the main cause because they aren't really felt from the lower classes or the masses, they're primarily reasons felt by the upper classes, perhaps with one exception, which I'll explain when we get there. It is something that falls throughout almost every single rebellion. So a very common cause, but not the most powerful or primary cause. Now, starting with Henry VII. Now, there are two rebellions under Henry VII, which are primarily political rebellions. And those are about the dynasty and securing the dynasty when Henry VII first comes to power. So we'll start with the Lambert-Simnel Rebellion. Now, political factors were the primary cause here, as the main cause is dynastic succession. They want to get rid of the Tudors and put a different ruling family back on the throne. Now, this comes right after the War of the Roses between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians, so therefore you have to contextualize it like that. Simnel pretends to be the Earl of Warwick, the son of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, who was the executed brother of King Edward IV. Warwick was a touchstone for Yorkist affections. He kind of became a figurehead that people could get behind who supported the Yorkist cause. They gained support from the Earl of Kildare in Ireland. 40 Irish nobles supported this, and they had funding from Margaret of Burgundy, really showing us that this is a political rebellion to change the king, to change the ruling family. The Earl of Lincoln, who supported this rebellion, was politically ambitious and dissatisfied with his court role as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. The second one, Perkin Warbeck, very, very similar, another pretender, again, a dynastic rebellion. He pretended to be the Duke of York, the murdered prince from the Tower, the youngest son of Edward IV. He was backed by France, Burgundy, and Scotland. Wished to remove the king, supported by pro-Yorkists. Reginald Bray and John Morton were also dubbed evil advisors, so you can also suggest that this is a rebellion where they wanted to change the people advising the king. But what you can notice from both of these first rebellions is that it's really purely all about the ruling family, and people supported these rebellions, first of all, because they arguably had to. If you were tenants, you would be raised by your landlord and you would have to go, but also because people did feel strongly about the idea of the divine right of kings and the ruling family who they believed should be on the throne. So people, the lower classes, were willing to support these rebellions because the Tudor regime had not been secured, had not been stabilized by this point. Now, in my video on economics, I said I would explain how you can suggest that the Yorkshire Rebellion was a politically motivated rebellion as well. And you can suggest that actually taxation was called in this instance to protect the country from threats. Therefore, you can suggest that money was being used for political reasons, and therefore that this arguably could be seen as a political rebellion because people are dissatisfied with the overall outcome of that money, where that money is going. Equally, York obviously was a Yorkist stronghold, which exacerbated people's resentments towards Henry Tudor. Taxation was used to defend the country. Sorry, we've skipped onto the Cornish Rebellion here. Again, I would suggest that you can say, while it was primarily an economic rebellion about taxation, it could also suggest that that taxation was needed to protect the country from Perkin Warbeck, and therefore it has political roots. It was used to protect the country from Perkin Warbeck, a political threat and pretender. Cornwall also saw itself as an autonomous entity. They spoke their own language, they had their own government, they resented centralisation and interference, something which Henry VII really kind of went for full frontal in order to unite the country, improve the centralised government and gain more money, extract more money from the country. He's known for being a very frugal and very economically minded king. Right, Henry VIII, Pilgrimage of Grace. So, whilst not the primary cause for the masses, political marginalisation of the upper classes, notably Northern Catholic nobility, motivated their participation. They cared about religion, but they also cared about their own power. And when the country shifted to being Protestant, it was Protestant nobility who were raised and elevated at court. Cromwell, Cranmer, Audley and Rich were also targets of ballads and manifestos written by the Pilgrims. I've got some evidence here. They said, expel all villain, blood and evil counsellors, persons of low birth and small reputation. They were all self-made men. Cromwell had been a merchant, Cranmer a Cambridge academic. So even from the lower classes here, the masses, there was resentment at these advisors. They wanted to change the political advisors that were advising the king. They also wanted the restoration of Mary to the succession and opposed Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Those political things have roots in obviously the religious motivations. And finally, we have the dissatisfied pro-Aragonese faction who stood to lose as long as Cromwell remained in favour. For example, Lord Darcy. So you've got political reasons that span the social hierarchy here. We've got the nobility who were involved, who were angry about their marginalisation. We've got everybody wanting to restore Mary and recognise the fact that you shouldn't get divorced under the Catholic faith. And we've got anger towards the people, the Protestant advisors they see as corrupting the king. Now, another final point that I think you can use here to really elevate and go A* with your arguments. From the Act of Supremacy, Henry becomes head of the church. Therefore, any rebellion against the British Church of England, the English, or the Church of England, should I say, apologies, any rebellion against the Church of England becomes a rebellion against the state, against the monarch, against the crown, which is therefore a rebellion of political motive. So I believe you can suggest that the Pilgrimage of Grace, although it's a rebellion against religion, and although they clearly state they don't want to go against their king, by going against his Church of England, they are going against the king. They are saying they want serious political, governmental changes to occur. Henry puts the Church of England under the English jurisdiction. He removes it from papal jurisdiction. And by doing that, to criticise that means you are criticising government legislation, you're criticising the political status quo. And therefore, this rebellion, while being primarily religious, has strong political connotations. That would be a very good A* assessment and synthesis to make. Now, Edward. Now, arguably, I know what I said about almost all rebellions having some political link, but I think under Edward, because of the point we've reached in the socio-economic conditions in England, these rebellions are primarily about religion or socio-economic factors. Going into Mary then. Yes, Mary does have political rebellions, and the first one is Northumberland, which is primarily solely a politically motivated rebellion. It was a desire to change the monarch, and it came after the death of Edward and the Lady Jane Grey disaster that occurs. So arguably there are some religious links. Northumberland wants to prevent a Catholic monarch taking power. However, it's most notably about him trying to retain his own position. He has been the most powerful person under Edward. Going into Mary, he correctly probably recognizes that he would lose power, potentially even be targeted as somebody she might want to remove, because of the very prominent Protestant role he played under Edward, and therefore he becomes very fearful of that loss of power, that marginalisation, and he creates this whole plan to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne. So he wants to follow through the Devese and exclude Mary from the succession. John Dudley, the Earl of Northumberland, had grown in power at the end of Edward's reign and was reluctant to lose this power or see England under the leadership of a Catholic queen. And then secondly, Wyatt. Now, arguably, this is a politically motivated rebellion. And it's a rebellion that even the masses really engaged in this political dissatisfaction. Wyatt claimed the rebellion was primarily motivated by a need for better counsel for the Queen. It was driven by this nationalistic fear of Spanish and papal intervention. Wyatt claimed, "We seek no harm to the Queen, but better counsel and counsellors." There is a very clear continuous theme here, which we've seen under previous rebellions as well, where they state very openly, this is not about the monarch, this is about creating better counsel for that monarch, changing those political advisors. Feared the influence of Philip of Spain, never admitted they wanted to overthrow Mary as an insurance in case the rebellion failed, but there was very clear xenophobia, dislike, fear of foreigners going on in England at the time. What was very interesting under the Tudors is that when Henry disengaged from the Catholic Church and had the Act of Supremacy in the Church of England, over the rest of his reign, he does slowly move back towards a Catholic stance. However, his form of Catholicism is absolutely separate from Rome. He likes elements of the faith. However, he does not like being told what to do by Rome and by the Pope. And so what we see by the end of his reign is Catholic almost in doctrine, but Protestant in practice. So removing that jurisdiction from the Pope. Now, when Mary comes to the throne, she goes back to a full frontal acceptance of Catholicism. She gets rid of the Act of Supremacy. She puts the power back into the Pope's hands. She also shows that desire for the marriage with Philip, a very powerful Catholic foreign power. And as a female monarch herself, England has become far more nationalistic than I guess she realizes, because of all of this time where they've been disjointed, divorced from Rome and those overarching powers telling them what to do. So they are far more unwilling to accept her form of Catholicism and the foreign influence that that would bring, by the point that she changes England back to being a Catholic country. One rebel admitted that the reason he joined was fear we would be overrun by strangers. Mary sensed the threat of these figureheads who people could rally behind, and use this rebellion to imprison Elizabeth and execute Lady Jane Grey. So poor Lady Jane Grey has been in the Tower of London ever since Northumberland's rebellion. She is not executed after that. Mary kind of takes pity on her, but it is after Wyatt that she is executed. She's not mentioned by Wyatt. She isn't really a part of this rebellion at all, to be honest. But Mary sees her as this Protestant figurehead that people can rally behind. Equally, Elizabeth, Wyatt himself is actually tortured to try and admit Elizabeth's role in the rebellion, and to the end he stays very strong in that sense that she was not involved in this at all. During this period of time when Elizabeth is imprisoned, it has a very strong impact on her and how she later is as a monarch. It's also where she spends a lot of time with Dudley, who she relies on very heavily when she becomes queen. And it has a very important impact on her life, this moment where she's not sure whether she's going to be killed or whether she's going to be allowed to live. And finally, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, yes, has politically motivated rebellions. Firstly, Shane O'Neill. So Shane O'Neill primarily rebelled for political reasons, reflecting a desire for an autonomous and independent Ireland. Religious differences and economic factors played a role in creating these underlying tensions. However, on their own, they weren't really big enough to create conflict. The colonisation of Ireland had been tumultuous from the beginning. Henry VIII had started this process, but there was very clear desires from the Irish for independence from England right from the start. And it was continually very, very difficult to keep the Irish under that English control, as I guess these monarchs had desired. Shane O'Neill had also been very content, perhaps that's an overstatement, he was content to work with the crown, but with the death of both Dudley and Cecil by kind of the late 1590s, two individuals he felt represented his interests, he now feels ostracized. He feels like he's been marginalized. And it's this feeling of marginalization, of political irrelevance, of isolation that catalyzes this rebellion. He disliked the interference from England in Ireland and the threat they posed against his captaincy of Tyrone. In addition, the Crown had also broken up the MacMahon lordship, which had led to resistance and the execution of MacMahon. This prompts O'Donnell and O'Neill to also resist this interference in Ireland that they dislike so much. And there was a growing presence of the English in plantations and brutal treatment of native Irish people who lived there originally. And it was all of this that really brought on these strong feelings of anger from Tyrone towards the English crown. Next, the Northern Earls. Northern Earls was a politically motivated rebellion, largely by marginalized Catholic nobility. Religion was used to incite the involvement of the masses. So though the nobility who were involved were motivated by religion, by political reasons, and the lower classes who were involved were motivated by religion. So there were dynastic issues and issues of succession. They stated they wanted the preservation of the person of Mary Queen of Scots as next heir, failing issue of Her Majesty. They did this in order to kind of deny they wanted to harm the Queen herself. However, if Elizabeth had put Mary Queen of Scots as her heir, she would be making herself a target, because having a Catholic heir named would mean that if she were killed, the Catholic heir would inherit. There were numerous plots against Elizabeth's life, and by making this statement, which is why she never actually does, she would make herself even more vulnerable to these assassination attempts. They blamed William Cecil, another example of blaming evil counsellors. There was the influence of the Northern Earls were in decline by this point, Westmoreland and Northumberland. They schemed to overthrow William Cecil. They held him responsible for ill-advised political religious decisions. So evidence again that we have kind of disgruntled, marginalized nobility who don't have the power they once had and who want to regain that power. They wanted the Duke of Norfolk to marry Mary Queen of Scots to ensure the continuity of Catholicism. And they had an overall hostility towards central government. Some tenants and employees of powerful magnates had no choice but to follow their masters. However, only 10% of this rebellion were tenants. And finally, Essex. So the Essex Rebellion was a desperate attempt by Essex to secure his financial assets and power under both Elizabeth and the new regime of James. His marginalization and loss of power were the primary motivating factor for this rebellion. So he denied he wished any harm to the Queen, but he wanted to endear himself to the heir presumptive, James of Scotland. He aimed to remove Robert Cecil, Elizabeth's principal advisor. That's the son of William, by the way. And this all stemmed from the political marginalization he felt after the Queen's disappointment in the way that he had handled Ireland. Devereux had been given the position of Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and he had been sent there with money and troops to go and defeat the O'Neill rebellion. However, what ended up happening was a complete mismanagement by Devereux himself, Essex, and he ended up signing a truce with O'Neill without the Queen's permission. He was then brought back to court, highly embarrassed, highly ashamed, and treated very, very well, what he felt to be unfairly, but pretty much marginalized by court. He had been suspended from the Privy Council, banned from court and charged with treason, and therefore he felt completely marginalized and desperate. In addition, his political marginalization also led to financial difficulties created by the Queen rescinding his right to sell sweet wine, and that put him in this state of complete and utter desperation where he went into rebellion against her. That is the end of my summary of political factors. All that's left is finally a conclusion video where I run through every monarch and summarize under each monarch really why we had rebellion in that period of time, giving you some overarching conclusions. Remember, your essay question will most likely give you a set of dates, and you need to say what was the main cause of rebellion under those dates. So you do need to know all this, you need to know all the evidence for each rebellion, but you really also need to have those overarching conclusions that track the main cause of rebellion over time. So please like and subscribe. It really helps me and means I can continue making these videos, which I think and hope are helpful. And yeah, that's it from me.